There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw the crucifixion of Jesus. Every historian in the world says that the crucifixion is a real and undeniable event. That would not be a problem for the Qur'an. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. It's Taha here. So, Christian apologist Wes Huff appeared on the Piers Morgan show back in Easter 2025 to speak about Christianity. But during the show, Wes said the Qur'an makes a historical error by denying the crucifixion of Jesus.
The text of the Qur'an, like all religious texts, including the Bible, has been misused, misinterpreted, or accurately interpreted, depending on who you talk to. From a historian perspective, how accurate do you think the Quran is, for example?
Well, I think the Quran has a number of problematic historical issues, the chief of which is that Surah 4:157 denies the historical crucifixion of Jesus. And so there's ambiguity as to what's going on in that text when it says that Jesus was neither killed nor was he crucified. And I think that really paints the historical reliability of the Quran into a corner, in that, like I said before, Piers, if there's one thing that even the most skeptical scholars historically will say, if they say we really can know not that much about Jesus of Nazareth, they will admit and say what we can know is that he did die under the reign of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea at that time, that he was indeed crucified. And so I find that the Quran has a number of very problematic historical issues.
Now, I'm not here to attack Christianity, but I'm here to defend the Qur'an's position, to show why it makes no historical error whatsoever. And I'm going to do this in 5 points, but stick around for points 4 and 5, because that's where I show why there is no contradiction between what the Qur'an says, what the Bible says, and what history says on the crucifixion. Yes, stick around for that, because those are points that you've probably never heard of before. Okay, let's begin then. So, point number 1. You see, there are a lack of eyewitness accounts to the crucifixion of Jesus. You see, none of the authors of the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John claimed to be eyewitnesses themselves, okay? The Gospels are not written in such a way that they are first-person eyewitness accounts. Now, I know that the Gospels mention people who saw the crucifixion, such as Mary Magdalene and maybe another Mary as well, and the disciple that Jesus loved. But the question is, where are the first-person eyewitness accounts from these eyewitnesses? Now, even Paul himself, Paul of Tarsus, who founded Christianity, even he was never an eyewitness to a crucifixion of Jesus, because he never met Jesus, he never saw Jesus, he was never a disciple of Jesus, right? And even in his writings that we find in the New Testament, such as Galatians, Ephesians, and Corinthians, and etc., in his writings or in his accounts, there is never a mention of any eyewitness accounts, any first-person eyewitness accounts of a crucifixion. Okay, point number 2. So, the Gospels were written decades after the time of the supposed crucifixion, right? Because the crucifixion is said to have happened in the year 33 AD, yet the Gospel of Mark is said to have been written somewhere between 65 to 70 AD, which is more than 30 years after the alleged crucifixion. And then the other Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John were written afterwards, meaning that all of the Gospels were written decades after the supposed crucifixion. So if they were written late, how can we rely on the accounts of the crucifixion therein? And then point number 3, you see, we don't know who wrote these Gospels, because the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not attributed to these Gospels until the year 180 CE, until around that time, okay, which is a long time after these Gospels were written. You see, this is according to the New Testament scholar and theologian E.P. Sanders in his book titled The Historical Figure of Jesus. So the actual authors of the Gospels are anonymous. So if we do not know who these authors are, how can we trust what they said? And hence, how can we trust the accounts of the crucifixion in those Gospels? Okay, so now we are at point number 4. So the Qur'an does not deny the crucifixion of Jesus in the absolute sense, because for argument's sake, let's say this. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw the crucifixion of Jesus. Every historian in the world says that the crucifixion is a real and undeniable event. Well, if that was the case, that would not be a problem for the Qur'an. Why? Because while the Qur'an denies the crucifixion of Jesus, at the same time, it does not deny that some apparent crucifixion had taken place, which is exactly why the Qur'an says that it was made to appear to them that Jesus was crucified. Hence the Qur'an says, شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. It was made to appear to them. In other words, according to Ibn Kathir's tafsir, somebody other than Jesus who looked like Jesus was crucified. And this would explain why there are so many eyewitnesses who say that Jesus was crucified, and why so many historians say so as well. Now, it's very interesting that the Qur'an says that the crucifixion of Jesus was something that was apparent, because if we look at the writings of early Christian bishops, they say that Jesus' crucifixion was only something apparent and not real, according to early sects which they deemed heretical. This is mentioned, for example, in the Panarion of Epiphanius and in the Epistle to the Smyrnians of Ignatius. And also, Jesus himself said that he did not die in reality but in appearance, and that's according to the second treatise of the Great Seth, which is a Gnostic text from the Nag Hammadi library. And in that text he also says that another man was nailed to his death instead. Also, Irenaeus in his work titled Against Heresies mentioned that Simon of Cyrene was said to resemble Jesus and hence was killed on the cross instead of Jesus. So basically we have records of early Christian sects that were deemed heretical who took a similar view of the crucifixion that is mentioned in the Qur'an. The view that the crucifixion was only something apparent. But that's not all the Qur'an says. When we read the verse even further, we find something else that is interesting about the crucifixion. Okay? And that brings me to point number 5. You see, the Qur'an says something else about the crucifixion which the New Testament agrees with, which the accounts of Paul agree with, right? So let's have a look at the accounts of Paul in the New Testament and let's see how they compare with what the Qur'an says on the crucifixion. The accounts of Paul show that the crucifixion was actually a disputed issue amongst early Christians, amongst those that he preached to. That's the key point that we take from the New Testament. Okay, so for example, in the book of Acts, chapter 17, when Paul preached Christianity to the people there, the people said, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Okay, and they say to Paul, "You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears." And it says that they sneered when they heard about the resurrection. So what does this show? This clearly shows that they mocked Paul's message about Jesus being raised from the dead. Also in the book of Galatians chapter 3, he says to them, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." So what does this mean? This means people were basically denying and doubting the crucifixion. Hence, that's why he's calling them foolish and bewitched. And also in Corinthians, okay, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 23, Paul says, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." You see, why do you think Paul says that the crucifixion of Jesus is a stumbling block? Because what he means is that the crucifixion is something that the people were denying. So this clearly shows that people were denying and doubting and disputing the crucifixion when Paul was preaching to them. Okay, so that's the point that we take from this verse. Now, what does the Qur'an say? Let's compare. The Qur'an says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ اخْتَلَفُوا فِيهِ لَفِي شَكٍّ مِّنْهِ, which means that basically people differed about the crucifixion and they were in doubt about it. And that's exactly what we find in the accounts of Paul that I've just quoted. People were denying and disputing the crucifixion. So the Qur'an is correct about the crucifixion. And this disagreement over the crucifixion is also evident from the writings of early bishops, such as Irenaeus' work titled Against Heresies, and it's also in the Paranion of Epiphanes, and it's also in the epistle to the Smyrnians written by Ignatius, because these works of these bishops were declaring the denial of the crucifixion as heretical. This answers the typical Christian argument that the Qur'an came 600 years after the crucifixion, therefore the Qur'an is wrong about the crucifixion. You see, the Qur'an is not the first source to deny the crucifixion. So what I have shown is everything that this verse says about the crucifixion, not just the bit that says Jesus was not crucified, but also the bit that says that it was made to appear that he was crucified, and also the bit that says that people were in doubt and people disputed about the crucifixion. Because if we have this holistic understanding of the Quranic verse, then we realize that there is coherency. We realize that there is consistency when we then look at the Bible and other ancient writings. So I hope you found this video insightful, and give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Leave a comment below and consider subscribing to me, and I shall see you in another video very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.